So without further ado, John Wager, here he is.
Thank you, Brian. I've drawn this presentation largely from Sir Lawrence Wackett's autobiography, which is a fascinating book. It outlines his career and his achievements, and also the adversities that he had to face quite well. And so I give credit to Sir Lawrence for that autobiography. He was, as the screen says, a pioneer with imagination and energy and skill, and a great deal of courage. Founded the Commonwealth-Aircraft Corporation, which provided the Royal Australian Air Force in World War II with the Wirraway, the Boomerang and the Mustang. He had great opposition in the process, not only from the British manufacturing interests, but also up until World War II from sections of the Australian government. He had great difficulty. He was born in Townsville in 1896. His parents were migrants in 1885. The name Wackett is a Quaker name. He had two siblings. He had a younger sister and a younger brother. Sadly, his father died when he was just 5 years old. It was an unfortunate suicide over business interests. Life became for him immediately very austere. He went from a private school to a state school. At age 7, he was given a birthday book. Expect no gains without pay. It was later adapted by him as a motto, Victoria non sine adversitate, which translates as success, but not without opposition. And later in his career, later in his life, that became part of the family crest. You will see the motto, Victoria non sine adversitate, and you can see that at that stage he was very much representing Australia. You can see the three boomerangs handheld, but you can also see, surmounting the whole thing, his interest in flying. His grandfather, replacing his father, ran bullock team, and he drove a team from Ballarat to their new home way up in Townsville. The grandfather operated between Townsville and Charters Towers and other mining sites. This is a photograph of his grandfather and also his mother. Now, I think if our mothers had appeared with a riding crop in their right hand while wearing a top hat, I think we too would have had as austere a bringing up as Wackett had. Wackett from a very early age had an interest in aircraft. He won a scholarship from his state school to a grammar school, and he learnt of the establishment of the Royal Military College at Duntroon. He secured an entrance to Duntroon. His was the third class to be enrolled in Duntroon. There he is, standing up straight with his hat on square and looking very businesslike. The military training at Duntroon was retrospective and very rigid. There was absolutely no concept of aircraft being even considered as relevant in warfare. There was training at Duntroon in horses, but there was no mention of armoured vehicles. Wackett mentioned aircraft, but he was silenced for heresy. There was no tuition in radio. Wackett devised an electric signalling system from his room to another in a more remote building. He did this by wiring up in the ceiling. And he had an interesting anecdote later in his life when, as a VIP, he was invited to visit Duntroon, and he learnt that the new occupant of his residence in Duntroon was being reprimanded for some strange wiring in the ceiling. He also, while there, devised and built an analogue device for setting timed fuses. The war was declared in August 1914. By June 1915, his class was graduated early. He was only 19. The choice for him and his colleagues was infantry or the light horse. And Wackett said, neither. That caused quite a rumpus. He was taken up before the CEO. He said, look, I've got a mechanical engineering background interest. I want to become an artillery officer. He put his case so clearly that many of his colleagues also joined him and became artillery officers. 2 months later, he learnt of the formation of the AFC, the Australian Flying Corps. He applied and was admitted. He went by ship on his last vacation before taking up the post. On that ship, he met a state school friend of his, confirmed their friendship, and they much later, married in London. His flying training with AFC was at Point Cook on Bristol box kites. And then with number 1 Squadron, AFC, he sailed in 1916 for Egypt. AFC was absorbed into the Royal Flying Corps, flying Avro biplane. He was based in Port Said, flying over the canal zone. He learned of the Fokker device enabling firing through the propeller. Wackett, with his engineering background, devised one from improvised parts. It was a great failure. There was a disastrous timing problem, but it was easily adjusted. And very soon service planes were issued with such devices factory fitted. He also devised a gun turret mounting to provide all-round fire. Earlier, aircraft just had forward firing cannon, or in those days machine guns. So the poor pilot had to not only fly the aircraft, sometimes defensively, sometimes otherwise, but when he wanted to be aggressive, he had to point the plane to fire the gun. This was the all-round mounting. Because of his mechanical interest, he was sent from the appointment back to the UK to the experimental station in Suffolk. And there he developed a mechanism to fire on planes from underneath. The idea was because at that time there were Zeppelins bombing England. And the idea was to get under a Zeppelin, unbeknownst we hope, and then fire on it from underneath, hoping that it wasn't dropping bombs at the time. But interestingly, he was never able to try that out. It was late one morning, he was awakened by the sound of a Zeppelin, and he realized that the 2 other aircraft in his group were already airborne and were firing at it. They were successful, and he was able to witness the downing, the crashing of the last of the Zeppelins to fly over England. He still had that photo. In 1918, he was sent back to the Western Front in France. He was with number 3 Squadron attached to the army, stationed near Amiens. General Monash asked Wackett to devise the restocking by air of ammunition to forward machine gun posts. Wackett was put in charge of 20 aircraft, which he fitted with wing racks for ammunition packs to be dropped by small parachutes of his design. This device was very significant in the 1918 Battle of Armour. For this and for distinguished day and night flying and spotting for artillery, he was awarded the DFC. I remember when Tiger Moths out at Maylands were doing sand bombing of targets for fun, and that was quite difficult. To be able to drop a parachute right into a machine gun nest when the machine gun was under fire would be quite a task. At the end of the war, for all of these activities, he was awarded the Air Force Cross. At the age of 23, it had been only 6 years since he left Townsville as a very young lad to go to Dundroon. 6 years of very sound experience in aviation. In 1919, Before repatriation to Australia, he was stationed in Wiltshire. He received special training. He flew Handley-Page bombers. He also learned to fly a flying boat from the Isle of Wight. His fiancée sailed to England. They were married in London in September 1919. In 1921, on return to Australia, he was assigned to the newly formed Air Corps unit from which the RAAF grew. He was stationed at Point Cook. He helped to set up the peacetime Air Force, largely from surplus British war stock. During that time, he also gained his Bachelor of Science from Melbourne University. And then, with the somewhat reluctant approval of the Air Board, he set up a factory in Randwick, up in Sydney, that was known as the RAAF Experimental Station. In 1924, he planned to design and build a small flying boat. It was single-engined with a wooden hull. It was designated the Widgeon 1. Notice, right from the start, his designs had retractable undercarriages. This was not just a ramp launching mechanism, it was an undercarriage. The controller of civil aviation wanted to accompany him on the flight. As a result, the aircraft was a bit overweight and a freak wave came and it caused it to sink. The press at that time were great in poo-pooing him because they had been fed information from a lot of the lobbyists in Australia who were lobbying for the British aircraft manufacturers. They did not want to see aircraft manufacturing begin in Australia. But Wackett immediately set about designing Widgeon 2. He put in a bigger 14-cylinder radial engine and again retractable undercarriage. And he successfully flew Widgeon 2 around Australia. Flying around Australia in the original model of your seaplane was quite an undertaking. He got to Perth. Here he is on Perth water in 1928. He was joined then in 1928 in Perth with 3 other aircraft from the RAF, also seaplanes who were flying around the bottom of Australia with a PEC 2 mil. In 1928, Wackett was appointed honorary ADC to the Governor-General, Lord Stonovan. Here he is in full regalia. In his book, he gives some interesting anecdotes about his life as an ADC. One task of this experimental station was to repair the wings of Kingsford-Smith's Southern Cross. Wackett was a very close contemporary of Sir Charles Kingsford-Smith. Here are his staff at the experimental station undertaking the repair. Despite the indifference and the ridicule from British aircraft manufacturers and disparagement in Australia, Wackett designed a 440 horsepower, 2-seater fighter, the Warrigal, quite a potent aircraft for its time, 1930. In 1931, the Australian government considered purchasing British-designed aircraft, and they closed the Randwick experimental station. Wackett was in a huff. He resigned from the RAAF. He set up a private industry company working in Sydney at the Cockatoo Dock. He designed a 6-passenger plane for Kingsford-Smith, known as the Codoc. There it is. There's Wackett on the left and Kingsford-Smith. Wackett also designed and built his own hydroplane that he raced. He was quite a versatile designer, builder and user. By 1935, he'd built 3 twin-engined passenger aircraft with 3 more under construction. He had 50 skilled employees in his private company and was planning an even bigger factory. And then, with the situation in Germany, the Australian government now wanted to develop an Australian aircraft manufacturing. Almost at the last minute, there was a meeting with Essington Lewis of BHP, Sir Colin Fraser of BHP Smelters, and Lawrence Hartnett of General Motors Holders. In 1936, Wackett was selected to lead a mission to Europe and to America. In London, the Australian High Commissioner, who'd been lobbied by the British aircraft manufacturers, was very sceptical. He visited aircraft factories in England and France and was successful even at that later stage in the 30s to visit and be welcomed in Junkers. It's my impression that Junkers were quite happy to show an Australian over their plant because they realised not only had Australia no aircraft manufacturing facility, but they, the Germans, were aware that their design and production machines were well ahead of anything in England. Wackett was very impressed with the scale of the Junkers factories. Actually, the Germans had already previously sent their engineers to America, and they had been following and repeating the American designs and undertakings for aircraft manufacture. So that when he did visit aircraft manufacture in America, he made the decision that that was the way for Australia to go, particularly as Bristol Aircraft at that time refused him a license agreement to build engines. So Wackett selected a Pratt & Whitney radial engine, and from the other side of America, the North American two-place trainer for the foundation of the Australian industry. So Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation was formed, and the founders were very potent. BHP Smelters, General Motors Holdings, ICI, and the Orient Steam Navigation Company. All of the resources that Wackett had been hoping for all his life. Wackett was appointed both manager and chief designer of CAC. Manager or chief designer would be a full-time job, but for him with both, it was a great undertaking and a great load. During plant construction, while the plant was being built, he led a team visiting US aircraft manufacturers. At the outset, CAC at Fisherman's Bend had two factory buildings. One was for engines, the other was for airframes. There was administration building, a drawing office, test houses, and relevant storage facilities. In 3 years, CAC had grown from nothing to 800 employees and provided a range of aircraft for the RAAF. Wackett's policy was to contract for licenses and then drew competent staff from his experimental station and then his private company. He purchased essential components, but more relevantly, he imported specific machine tools for the manufacture of aircraft engines. This shows him with some Gleason bevel cutting machines as part of his engine manufacture. This is the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation in 1942, and this is his Wirraway and the Wackett trainer, Wirraway production lines. This was the prototype Wackett bomber in 1941. This was the Boomerang, 1942. This, some of his senior staff, the Mustang, and particularly the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce engine. That combination, the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce engine, was, I think, the greatest contribution Wackett made to RAAF and to Australia. He developed the CA-15 prototype based on the Mustang, and this I believe was one of the potentially most potent aircraft of its type. The Windshield. In 1952, CAC was progressing from building and testing Rolls-Royce Neen engines for the Vampires. The Neen had about 5,000 pounds thrust. You remember, it was a centrifugal compressor jet engine. Moving to the Rolls-Royce Avon, which was an axial flow compressor with up to 10,000 pounds thrust. And the first test of the Avon engine was on Monday, the 22nd of December, 1952. This stage of the presentation that I pause to make a minor presentation on the part of John Wager, because for the engineering degree for which I enrolled in 1949, That degree spanned 5 years, and by design, the particular year, the 4th year, was to be gaining experience in industry. And I thought, where better in Australia in 1952 to get great experience, not only in design but in manufacturing, would be Commonwealth Aircraft. I applied for a job, I was successful, and I was assigned in 1952 as a fitter's mate in the test house division. And I thought, hang on, why don't I look through my archives? Because I vaguely remember in my memory that I was an avid note taker in that year, and I might still have one of my notebooks. I found it. And so this goes back 60 years. I plan to read to you what I wrote on Monday the 22nd of December 1952. I'm reading you the original, which was written in pencil. I wrote in those days in a very fine script, which amazes me today. But this is Monday the 22nd. Today I had a most interesting experience. Thursday, Friday and today I've seen great activity here in the test house over the first run of the Avon RA3. There were 2 runs scheduled for today, the first at 11 a.m. for the foreman and department bosses. We were able to observe from a soundproof window overlooking the tailpipe. Now, of course, here, to give you a bit of a layout, this is a set of stairs leading up to the control room, where there were instruments to measure temperature, pressure, speeds, control, amount of fuel used and the like. There was an observation window to look out on the performance of the engine. And immediately above the control room there was an enclosure for the inlet air for the vast amount of air that the Avon was consuming. This had 2 vertical baffles. They were triangular shaped baffles, 2 of them, leaving 3 compartments through which the air was drawn into the Avon. The Avon was assessed through the control room, and aft of the Avon was this guide vent. This is diagrammatic. It shows that the guide vent was on a frame which had wheels which were on rails, and the wheels had ratchets to stop the vent being blown backwards by the blast from the Avon. The idea was to constrain the blast so that it could go completely to the diffuser. We were at the stage where, for that morning display, we were able to watch through soundproof windows overlooking that tailpipe. We saw the cartridge start, and after cruise revs for some minutes, we saw the acceleration tests causing anti-stall valves to operate Dunlop plungers to blanking off lanes in front of the compressor. It was noticed as the Avon was brought to full revolutions, the vent was drawn forward towards the engine despite the ratchet, because the Avon develops over 7,500 pounds thrust even at that version, that full revolution. Our job, we were working through lunch, was to devise and make up a stop for this. And then I noted in the afternoon at 3 o'clock was scheduled an RA3 run for all the big brass to show off the new test house and the powerful new motor to the financial backers, also the potential buyers. We had Wacker. Now, I've got to pause here and say But on the shop floor, the name that was used for Sir Lawrence Wackett was Wacko. This was partially, I guess, due to the Australian propensity to truncate names, such as a utility vehicle became a ute and the afternoon became arvo. I think calling him Wacko had a slightly denigratory implication to it, but not at all. Everybody on the floor really appreciated Wing Commander Wackett. And in the 1950s, I think you might remember that the term wacko meant something very good. In fact, there was a phrase, some of us might remember, wacko the diddler. So what I'm saying is, although I had written here wacko, it was no disrespect at all. So we had Wacko, Air Chief Marshal Jones, the RAAF Big Brass, Civil Aviation heads, Cabinet Ministers. They'd all come to see the RA3 just squeeze its first run into 1958 on the 22nd of December. Naturally, for this, we were all ushered out very forcibly and all given rather pointless jobs to do elsewhere. This was obviously for two reasons. Number one, to get us away from the test house, and number two, when the bigwigs appeared, we all looked very industrious. As we could see the VIP cars rolling down from the engine factory, one old hand, his name was Jim Ford, gave Ron and myself a call. Jim was into the actual building of the RA3 test house and knew how to get onto the draft baffle landing. Before we knew what had happened, we were up on the roof watching the bigwigs roll up in their Daimlers and Bentleys and Rolls. We kept behind the parapet till they were inside and then wormed our way round the roof until we could reach the vane entrance. One guard saw us and looked alarmed, but he was not a regular, so we looked as if we did this every day and kept on. Luckily, he did nothing about it. We were able to squeeze up in between the vanes and reach position X, which overlooks the test cell above the control room. By keeping our heads down on the floor, we could see bigwigs moving about. They didn't notice us because the inlet is black and spotlights were mounted at spot X. We could hear Wacko giving them the screed. Then they filed into the control room. We had to be quite still here because they filed beneath us. Then the siren went and the starter cartridge filled the cell with black smoke and she roared off to cruise RPM. In the small cell and with a detuner fitted, she made a hell of a row. Even technicians are only allowed into the cell up to 4,000 revs, and even then with big earmuffs. We were the first three to be inside a cell with an Avon running. We stayed up there with our hands over our ears for the whole of the bigwigs demo. The acceleration tests up to peak RPM were mighty. The roar was terrific. The whole cell shook with the thrust. We stayed there for about half an hour. Then the big brass went to inspect the rig room and we whipped back and climbed down from the roof. Fortunately, no one saw us. So that's my minor contribution. The Avon Sabre was a great success. The RAAF Avons, you see, in service ready. Sir Lawrence Wackett received a knighthood in 1954. He and his wife built a home for themselves in Beaumaris. In his autobiography, he mentions he named the house AANEEZEE. And when I was reading his autobiography, I thought it must have been some Dutch connotation because AAN and ZEE sounds a bit Dutch. And Beaumaris is seaside, bayside residents. And it was only slowly becoming evident to me that it was harking back to his Duntroon days, because that's what the regimental sergeant major would have said in a very unintelligent sergeant major voice when he was trying to say, "Troops, stand easy." It would come across as uneasy. So that's what he did. He stood easy. In 1958, he designed and he built a small yacht which he and his wife sailed in Port Phillip at Beaumaris. Interestingly, this would have been within a few years and only a few kilometres where our friend Neville Shute, of whom we heard last time, would have been sailing his own two-person yacht in Davy Bay. Very interesting coincidence. There's his sailboat, and you'll see the crest on the mainsail of the boat is from his family crest with a hand holding the boomerang. He died in 1982. A Knight Commander of the British Empire, Order of the British Empire, and the Air Force Cross. Quite a pioneer and worthy of our recognition. A pilot, a designer of airframes, a manufacturer, an entrepreneur, and a manager. Thank you.